The last chapter we're going to talk about for this unit is the endocrine system. Okay, so the endocrine system is often compared with the nervous system because they can both exact control over the body, but there's a lot of distinct differences between these two systems. So the endocrine system uses hormones, which are secreted by a variety of glands. The nervous system uses neurotransmitters. So these hormones pass within the bloodstream. That's how they're distributed throughout the body. Whereas our neurotransmitters are secreted into a synapse, like we talked about previously. So because the endocrine system distributes its hormones into the bloodstream typically, it's going to be a slow response because it has to travel throughout the body and actually exact its effect. The alternative to that is that it's actually a long-lasting effect, even though it's a slow onset. So we use our endocrine system to slowly adapt to constant stimuli. On the other hand, our nervous system tends to respond quickly, and its impulses exhibit or exert short-lived effects. So this is our quick changes or quick adaptations to continuous stimuli, our nervous system. Okay, so this is just a highlight of all the different organs of the endocrine system. So you see a lot of smaller glands, not a lot of large structures. So there also are some small cells in different organs, like the brain, the heart, the small intestines. But the structures that are highlighted in the picture on your right are truly the endocrine system. And so they have no ducts. Endocrine glands will go directly into the bloodstream. They are ductless. So one way we classify hormones is a steroidal hormone versus a non-steroidal hormone. So what is classified as a steroidal hormone are those that are synthesized from cholesterol. And the advantage of these is that they pass easily through a cell membrane. The non-steroidal hormones are protein-based rather than cholesterol-based. They can't penetrate the cell walls, so to get into a cell, they have to bind to a receptor on the surface. So what's a characteristic of endocrine glands? Employ neurotransmitters, carry secretions to the body's surface, exert a long-lasting effect, respond quickly to stimuli. Think back to that comparison chart. So C, they exact a long-lasting effect. Remember, even though they're a little bit slow to respond, the effect they exert is long-lasting. So our nervous system employs neurotransmitters. Our nervous system also is our quicker response. And the endocrine system releases those hormones directly to the bloodstream. They do not go to the body's surface. Okay, so our first highlight here is the pituitary gland and the hypothalamus. So our pituitary gland is kind of the master gland of the endocrine system. So it influences the body more than any other endocrine gland, even though it's super tiny. It's only pea-sized. It sits directly under our hypothalamus in the brain. The area is known as the sella turcica. Yeah, if you remember back from our skeletal system chapter, we talked about the sella turcica holding the pituitary gland in terms of the bony structure. And then the pituitary gland is broken into the anterior and the posterior because of the differences in how it secretes its hormones. The anterior pituitary is the larger. It has a lot of important hormones, and the hormones in the anterior pituitary are kind of controlled, or the release of these hormones are controlled by the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus has a lot of hormones that trigger the release of other hormones. So these hormones tend to travel from the hypothalamus to the pituitary gland. So gonadotropin releasing hormone. So this comes from the hypothalamus to the pituitary to promote secretion of follicle stimulating hormone as well as luteinizing hormone. You also have thyrotropin releasing hormone, and that promotes the secretion of TSH or thyroid stimulating hormone. You have corticotropin releasing hormone, which promotes secretion of adrenocorticotropic hormone or ACTH. So you'll see the theme here is the hypothalamus releases a hormone, which causes the release of another hormone. So prolactin releasing or inhibiting hormone. So that's kind of self-explanatory. It either promotes or inhibits prolactin. And then our growth hormone releasing hormone, which of course causes the secretion of growth hormone. So that's all from the hypothalamus. So then we get on to the actual anterior pituitary. So the anterior pituitary has thyroid stimulating hormone or TSH. This is also known as thyrotropin. Prolactin comes from the anterior pituitary. We have adrenocorticotropic hormone, also known as ACTH, follicle stimulating hormone, FSH, luteinizing hormone, LH, or growth hormone, GH. This is also known as somatotropin. So you'll notice that a lot of the hormones of the anterior pituitary are the hormones that the hypothalamus causes the release of. So the anterior pituitary gland is largely governed by the hypothalamus. Our posterior pituitary, on the other hand, has a little less hormones total. It's the smaller of the two. So the posterior pituitary is made of neural tissue rather than glandular tissue like the anterior. So that's part of what makes the distinction between the two. So the two most important things that the posterior pituitary secretes is antidiuretic hormone, also known as ADH, and oxytocin, which is under the abbreviation of OT. So oxytocin stimulates contraction of the uterus during childbirth, and it also triggers lactation or the release of breast milk. ADH is also known as vasopressin, and it has a very important role in blood pressure and blood volume / fluid regulation. So it acts on the kidneys to reduce our urine volume. So this helps us prevent dehydration. So if you break down the word anti-diuretic, so it stops us from urinating, and this in turn keeps us more hydrated. So that all comes from the posterior pituitary. So remember, the big distinction is the types of tissue. Anterior pituitary is glandular, posterior pituitary is neural. The anterior pituitary is larger. It is also governed by the hypothalamus, whereas the posterior pituitary is not quite as reliant on that. Okay, so the pituitary gland is the master gland, so it's really important that we control or regulate the pituitary secretions. So this is done in two different ways. So our central nervous system has a role in this. So our brain can kind of monitor what's going on and help decide what to do with the pituitary secretions. So it can trigger additional hormone release as needed, or can decide that we do not need more hormones coming out of the pituitary gland. It also has a negative feedback system. That's the primary control. So in general, our pituitary gland is stimulated to release a specific hormone. If we end up getting a feedback saying, hey, that hormone is high in concentration, it'll then halt the release of additional hormone. So too much hormone equals reduction in release. So that's our negative feedback system. Okay, so review question 2. A key difference between anterior and posterior pituitary gland is the posterior pituitary, A, consists of glandular tissue, B, secretes hormones under the direction of the hypothalamus, C, receives hormones from the hypothalamus via the hypophyseal portal system, or D, stores hormones released from the hypothalamus. So think back to what we just discussed. A lot of this discusses the anterior, so pick out the posterior pituitary portion. So D, all the other statements are characteristic of the anterior pituitary. So the posterior pituitary does store some hormones released from the hypothalamus. A through C all discusses the anterior pituitary gland function. All right, our adrenal glands. So these sit directly on top of the kidneys. So the kidneys themselves are not part of the endocrine system or major portions of the endocrine system, but the adrenal glands, which sit on top of them, are a very important part of the endocrine system. So our adrenal glands consist of two types of tissues. We have the outer cortex, or the adrenal cortex. This is a glandular tissue that secretes our steroid hormones, known as corticosteroids. We also have the medulla, or the inner tissue. And this has modified neural tissue. So this is actually, the medulla is actually considered a part of our sympathetic nervous system. So catecholamines are a category of a neurotransmitter, or what we would consider a hormone classification that prepare the body for physical activity. They cause an increase in heart rate and blood pressure. They also cause increase, or in turn, this causes increased circulation to muscles. Bronchioles also dilate. That allows more oxygen in. Catecholamines also boost glucose levels by breaking down glycogen from the liver into glucose. Fatty acids are also broken down into amino acids and glucose. So when our adrenal glands secrete these catecholamines, our body's kind of ready to go. So if you think of the term adrenaline, that helps you remember that our adrenal glands secrete catecholamines that have our body ready to rock and roll. Okay, we're going to talk about this a little bit more in depth. So this top half of things don't get too caught up in, but chromatin cells are the type of cells that are considered part of the sympathetic nervous system and secrete those catecholamines. The catecholamines, you've probably heard of the term epinephrine and norepinephrine. Those are your catecholamines, so those may be more familiar terms to you. So this adrenal cortex actually consists of our three different layers of glandular tissue. And so all these different layers secrete a different type of hormone. So you have the zona glomerulosa, or the glomerulosa secretes our mineralocorticoids. The zona fasciculata secretes our glucocorticoids, and our zona reticularis secretes our sex steroids. Okay, so the primary mineralocorticoid is aldosterone. This acts on our kidneys to promote sodium retention and potassium excretion. So increased aldosterone causes water retention. That's the big picture for our mineralocorticoids. Our glucocorticoid, our primary one, is cortisol. So this is our stress hormone. So it helps us adapt to stress. It also is part of the process for repairing damaged tissue. And it causes the release of glucose, or conversion of glucose from glycogen as well as from amino acids. So cortisol also has an anti-inflammatory effect and suppresses our immune system. It also helps maintain a normal blood pressure. If you ever heard of the term cortisone injection, it kind of mimics our cortisol response, so it dials down our inflammatory response. Finally, we get to the sex steroids. Yeah, the main thing to think about here is that they're a weak form of androgen. They're converted to a more potent testosterone. There's a little bit of estrogen as well. So you need to know the zones and what each kind of zone secretes, but don't worry about the details within this. This is more of a nice to know slide. Okay, I would like you guys to go through this whole hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis here. But I am not going to walk you through every single step of the way. Again, this is more of a nice to know than a need to know. But it is a really good example of how the endocrine and nervous system work together, and how a lot of the different hormones within the endocrine system influence one another, but you will not be tested on this stuff um, in detail. Okay, the pineal gland, the main thing you need to know is that this is your melatonin secreting gland. I'm sure most of you have heard of melatonin. That's what helps you fall asleep at night. It's very popular for people to take melatonin supplements, but your pineal gland should supply the melatonin that you need. Your thymus, the main thing to know about your thymus gland is that it has a role in the development of the immune system. Your thyroid gland. So you can have hypothyroidism, meaning you don't have enough secretion from your thyroid. You can also have hyperthyroidism, which means you have too much secretion from your thyroid gland. So the main thing that your thyroid gland actually controls is your metabolism. So hyperthyroidism means you have a hyperactive metabolism, while a hypothyroidism means your metabolism is moving too slow. So you see there's two large lobes here, and then this narrow band that connects these lobes is known as your isthmus. So this is a zoom in on your thyroid tissue. So you have thyroid follicles, which are these larger circles, and then the inside is thyroid colloid. Just so you guys know, this is a nice to know slide, not need to know slide. Just gonna talk you through it. So T3 and T4 are what are secreted by the thyroid. So it's two different types of hormones here. Calcitonin is also secreted, and this has to do with blood calcium. We'll talk about calcium regulation here shortly. The parathyroid gland actually kind of sits right on the thyroid itself. So this is your isthmus and lobe. These little dots are your parathyroid, so right on top of it. So they also secrete hormones and primarily are stimulated by low blood levels of calcium. So parathyroid hormone is how we maintain our calcium. It's part of our homeostasis. So parathyroid inhibits new bone formation. It stimulates breakdown of old bone. So it encourages the breakdown of our bones. It also encourages our kidneys to reabsorb our calcium and activate vitamin D, which is also part of the absorption process for calcium. Okay, so this chart shows the thyroid and parathyroid concept, or the calcium homeostasis that they regulate. So on the left side, you see if we have too much calcium in our blood, our thyroid gland is going to release calcitonin. Calcitonin causes calcium to go from the bloodstream to the bone. So calcitonin causes retention of calcium by the bone. This in turn causes our blood calcium to decrease because the calcium has gone into the bones. If we don't have enough calcium in our blood, the parathyroid is going to release parathyroid hormone. The calcium is going to move from our bones, our intestines, our kidneys. It's all going to go back to the bloodstream, which then causes an increase in our blood calcium levels. So it's all a balance between the release of calcitonin and the release of parathyroid hormone to make sure that our blood calcium levels stay normal. So which endocrine gland has a role in the immune system? That would be your thymus gland. Remember, thyroid gland we just talked about has a role in our calcium homeostasis. The pineal gland is our melatonin gland. The pituitary gland we know has a lot of functions. We talked about that a while back, but the thymus has a role in the immune system. Okay, our pancreas is another super important part of the endocrine system. It also has exocrine tissue, which we'll talk about here shortly. So our pancreas is really the main control system for our blood glucose and our glucagon and kind of our whole sugar regulation system. So people that have diabetes, their pancreas is not functioning as it should. So the pancreas has a few different types of cells. So we have alpha cells. This secretes the hormone glucagon between meals. And so glucagon causes liver cells to convert glycogen into glucose. So between meals, we don't have the energy regularly available. So because we don't have food right away, we're going to go ahead and break down some of our storage to create glucose. So when glucagon is released, our glucose levels are going to increase in our bloodstream. Our beta cells are super important because they secrete insulin. So insulin is going to be what causes our blood glucose level to decline. It causes cells to uptake glucose. So diabetics tend to inject insulin so that their blood sugar is not too high. They need their blood or their cells to uptake sugar to get rid of it from the bloodstream. Finally, we have delta cells, which secrete somatostatin, and this helps regulate our other endocrine cells. So beta cells are the big one out of those three. Exocrine cells are also part of the pancreas. These are also known as Athene cells, and so they secrete digestive enzymes into ducts that drain into the small intestine. So the big difference here is that they have ducts, whereas endocrine and the previous three cells go directly to the bloodstream. And this is going into the small intestine rather than the bloodstream. Like I said, alpha cells, glucagon, beta cells, insulin, delta cells, somatostatin. Just remember what type of hormone each cell secretes. Okay, so let's just walk through the whole regulation of blood glucose because this is a very clinically applicable topic. So of course, right after eating, our blood glucose levels are going to rise because they're going to go from the digestive tract into our bloodstream. So that kind of increase in glucose stimulates our beta cells to secrete insulin. They see, okay, glucose is elevated in the bloodstream. We need our cells to balance that back out. The only way to trigger them to do that is the release of insulin. So once that insulin's released, the cells decide to uptake more glucose, and the liver decides that it can take the excess glucose and store it as glycogen for later use. So this brings that balance back to the middle here. Like we said, when blood glucose ends up dropping, our alpha cells can release glucagon that causes the liver to break down glycogen into glucose, and our blood glucose concentration then increases or balances back out. Okay, our sex cells, in females we have our ovaries. That's our primary sex organ, which secretes estrogen. In males we have the testes, which secrete testosterone. That's the big highlights from those. This gives a little bit of just a highlight of how the microbiome and the endocrine system are related to each other. but you will not have any specific test questions on this. This is kind of just a nice to know, connect the dots type slide. All right, final review question. The chief role of insulin is to A, stimulate cells to take up glucose, B, stimulate the liver to break down glycogen, C, stimulate pancreas to release glucagon, or D, trigger the conversion of fatty acids and amino acids into glucose. The correct answer there is A, stimulate the cells to take up glucose. So remember, glucagon would stimulate the liver to break down stored glycogen. Low blood glucose concentration would stimulate the pancreas to release glucagon, which would then stimulate the liver to break down glycogen. And then fatty acids and amino acids, the gluconeogenesis, that also would be low blood glucose concentration, not insulin. All right, that's the end of our endocrine chapter. Take a look at the study guide prior to the exam, and good luck. This wraps up this unit.